Michael J. Glennon is professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Democracy at Tufts University. He has been legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and Thomas Hawkins Johnson Visiting Scholar at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Professor Glennon has served as a consultant to various congressional committees, the U.S. State Department, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. He is a member of the American Law Institute and the Council for Foreign Relations. Professor Glennon is the author of numerous articles on constitutional and international law, as well as several books. His op-ed pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, International Herald-Tribune, Financial Times, and Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. The paperback edition of his latest book, National Security and Double Government, was published this year by Oxford University Press. He's the author of the article Security Breach in the current issue of Harper's Magazine. I can tell you that this book, National Security and Double Government, is one of the most profound and insightful books you will ever read. It's with real pleasure, please welcome Professor Michael Glennon.
Jacob, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me to be here and for organizing this wonderful conference. It's really a privilege to be a part of it. I think it was worth coming from Boston just to hear Professor Sachs' magnificent speech. Thank you very much for that. A couple of years ago, I did write this book that I hope might shed at least a little light on the assassination of President Kennedy. It's called National Security and Double Government, as Jacob mentioned. And it tries to explain a phenomenon that Professor Sachs just alluded to, the dominance of the national security bureaucracy in American policymaking. The book drew largely on my own experience as legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1970s, where I worked with Senators Frank Church, Jacob Javits, George McGovern, and their colleagues. In that capacity, I did inevitably learn a bit, or at least hear a bit, about the Kennedy assassination. Never discussed this publicly, but I think that today is probably the right time to do that. I must tell you at the outset that I, however, remain a thoroughgoing skeptic. As I will suggest, when it comes to the making of national security policy, I doubt that our government is what it appears to be. I also doubt that any firm conclusion can be drawn from anything that I know or anything that I have heard concerning who was behind the assassination of President Kennedy. My skepticism is overcome, however, by the record of the Warren Commission. I have no doubt that the Warren Commission led the way in eroding public respect for American institutions. And I have no doubt that the Commission was undermined in its investigation by the same distrust of democracy that has pushed the United States into the system of what I call double government. Let me begin, therefore, by quickly outlining the notion of double government. Theory was developed in 1867 by Walter Bagehot, one of the founders of The Economist magazine. His theory has since been regarded in Britain as the most respected and indeed probably the standard explanation of how the British government operates. In a nutshell, Bagehot's theory was this: power in Britain was initially exercised by the monarch in the House of Lords. Bagehot called these Britain's dignified institutions, dignified in the sense that they embody memories of greatness. They invoke the grandeur of ages past with magnificent pomp and ceremony. Yet Bagehot wrote that it's, in fact, a second set of institutions that do the real day-to-day work of governing. These are Britain's efficient institutions, the House of Commons, the Cabinet, and the Prime Minister. They operate backstage and over the years have moved Britain quietly in the direction of a concealed republic. Quietly and concealed, Bagehot said, because a crisis of confidence would have occurred if the people had been aware of the massive transfer of power that had taken place. Bagehot calls this dual structure, double government. I suggested in my book that in the years following World War II, the United States, in the realm of national security, has also slipped unintentionally into a system of double government. This explains, in large part, why national security policy has changed so little from one administration to the next, most notably from the recent Bush administration to the Obama administration. The American people have believed that America's so-called dignified institutions, Congress, the President, and the courts, manage the nation's national security. But in reality, security policy has been formulated largely by a concealed network of several hundred officials who head the military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies of the United States government. These are the United States' efficient institutions. Unlike Britain's experience, however, America's double government has moved steadily in the opposite direction, away from democratic accountability and toward autocracy. This drift toward autocracy has not, in my view, been the result of any enormous, nefarious conspiracy. Quite the contrary, the managers of the security bureaucracy are for the most part smart, dedicated, loyal, patriotic Americans. They simply respond, often entirely rationally, to incentives that are buried deeply within the structure of the American political system. They are specialists who are possessed of considerable experience and expertise in the realm of national security. So naturally, they resist what they see as kibitzing by generalists in Congress, in the courts, or even on the president's own staff. Conversely, judges and elected officials don't want to take the blame for potential national security calamities. Therefore, they have a powerful incentive themselves to defer to the judgment of the experts. Over the years, the net effect of all this has been that the security powers of Congress, the courts, and even the presidency have trickled away, while the power of the bureaucracy has steadily increased. Obviously, the dynamic is more complicated than that, but that's basically how double government works. Now, Walter Bagehot believed that the stability of this dualist structure was made possible. Indeed, he believed that the stability depended upon the dignified and efficient institutions presenting a united front to the public and avoiding open disagreement. Harmony between the two, at least in the eyes of the public, is essential, Bagehot believed, to maintain governmental legitimacy. An open split would make the system dangerously unstable. And Bagehot believed that the whole structure under those circumstances would, like a spinning top, in his words, fall to earth. So until recently, both sets of institutions responded to this incentive structure by instinctively trying to present a public show of unity. All this, of course, raises some unsettling questions about America's current situation, some of which I try to address in Harper's article in the current issue. An unprecedented open rift has developed between the intelligence community and President Trump. The question is, what would it mean for the system to fall to earth? Can we, should we, rely upon the military, intelligence, and law enforcement bureaucracies to block presidential policies that some of us might consider misguided, but which are nonetheless democratically adopted and which are at least arguably entirely legal? Now, I won't address those questions here. You can probably guess at my answer, except to suggest that this is not the first time that America's security bureaucracy has been urged to step in to play the role of platonic guardians to save the people from themselves. I'm referring, of course, to the Warren Commission. The security bureaucracy tried to steer the commission toward what the CIA later referred to as, quote, the best truth. I want to focus here today on one specific way the CIA's leaders tried to do that, namely by not disclosing to the commission that the CIA had been engaged in efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro. 3 years ago, the CIA acknowledged in a remarkably candid report that the decision of, quote, agency leaders in 1964 not to disclose information about the CIA's anti-Castro schemes might have done more to undermine the credibility of the commission than anything else that happened while it was conducting its investigation, unquote. That's quite an admission. But if anything, I think it's rather an understatement. The Warren Commission represented the very pinnacle of the American establishment. Look at its members. Chief Justice of the United States, former Governor of California, Earl Warren, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Richard Russell, after whom the new Senate office building is named, the House Democratic Whip, Hale Boggs, the Chairman of the House Republican Conference, Gerald Ford, who would become president 10 years later, head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, Ford Foundation, and Council on Foreign Relations, John McCloy, the brother of Eisenhower's Secretary of State and former head of the CIA, Allen Dulles. If the American people could not trust these men, who could they trust? And the people did trust them. A week after Kennedy's assassination, only 29% of people surveyed believed that Oswald acted alone. After the Warren Commission released its report 10 months later, 87% of the American people believed that Oswald acted alone. In the coming years, of course, in dribs and drabs, the truth came out, as it so often does, and the public learned what the Commission had not learned. It learned that the CIA, under Allen Dulles, had plotted to assassinate Fidel Castro. In November of last year, ABC News reported that only 32% of the American people now believe that Oswald acted alone. 68% of Americans believe that there was an official cover-up to hide the truth about the assassination from the public. So the reality is that the CIA's non-disclosure of its efforts to kill Castro undermined far more than the credibility of merely the Warren Commission. The agency's actions undermined the credibility of the American government. Before the Commission's report in November of 1964, public trust in American government was at an all-time high. Listen to this. 77% of the American people trusted the government just about always or most of the time. In June of 2013, 79% of Americans said they never trusted the government or did so only some of the time. Obviously, there have been many events that have occurred over the last 50 years that have also eroded trust with the government: Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you know the list. But the Warren Commission's report was the real deal breaker. It was the first, and really the worst, evidence that, as the great Senator J. William Fulbright later bluntly put it, the government lies. It was the worst because President Kennedy was like family to millions of Americans. When I was in 6th grade, I passed out JFK all the way buttons at the back of a Nixon rally. I was the pro-Kennedy debater in our civics class presidential debate. I used to come home from grade school in the afternoon and watch his press conferences. Our family got teary-eyed laughing at Vaughn Meader's impersonation of Kennedy in The First Family. Many of my classmates felt and reacted as I did. We loved John Kennedy. He was our president. We had never loved an elected official before. And at that point in our lives, I dare say, I think most of us had never known anybody who had died. So Kennedy's death hit us very hard. It hit us very hard. And then later we learned that the government had covered up important facts about why he died, the same government that John Kennedy had inspired us to admire and trust. The Warren Commission had issued a report that could not be trusted, which was the most shocking and saddest realization of all. The American government could not be trusted, and the American government did not trust the American people. Now, think for a moment what the Warren Commission might have asked if it had been aware of the CIA's attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. All the questions that have since become fodder for conspiracy theories could have been explored in a thorough, high-level, professional investigation while the evidence was still fresh. Did Castro know about the CIA's plots to kill him? Did he retaliate against Kennedy? Was Oswald working for the Cubans? Did Oswald have accomplices in Cuba or elsewhere? Were disgruntled, anti-Castro Cuban exiles involved? The CIA has also enlisted, of course, the help of the Mafia. Whose side was the Mafia really on? All those questions and many more were relevant and material to the issue whether Oswald acted alone. None of those questions could have been investigated adequately without knowing that the CIA engaged the Mafia and anti-Castro Cubans to kill Fidel Castro. So the obvious question for me at this point is how the CIA's omissions relate to this idea of double government. Think about this in considering three specific issues. First, who knew about the Castro assassination plots? Second, when did they know it? And third, why did they not inform the Warren Commission? First, who knew? Richard Helms testified before the House Assassinations Committee in 1978 that all kinds of people knew about these operations high up in government, unquote. Helms was, of course, right, so let's begin with the CIA. Richard Helms knew. Helms was Deputy Director of Plans during the Commission's investigation. He had earlier either approved or participated directly in several efforts to kill Castro during Operation Mongoose, which Attorney General Robert Kennedy apparently managed. Helms said nothing about that to the Warren Commission. Allen Dulles knew. The Church Committee was never able to reach a firm conclusion, but a CIA document that was declassified in June of 2007 stated unequivocally that in 1960 Dulles, quote, was briefed and gave his approval, unquote, to a plot to assassinate Castro. John McCone, Dulles' successor as DCI, testified in 1978 that he assumed that Dulles, who was DCI when the plots originated, would have told the Warren Commission about the plots. He was, after all, a member of the commission, but he did not. John McCone knew. McCone was DCI when the Warren Commission conducted its investigation. McCone claimed in that 1978 testimony that he did not know about the plots. He said that knowledgeable CIA employees, quote, withheld that information from me, unquote. That statement, the CIA euphemistically acknowledged in 2014, quote, was neither frank nor accurate. By the time McCone testified to the commission in May of 1964, the CIA concluded McCone, quote, had known about the mafia plots to kill Castro for 9 months, but he chose not to mention them, unquote. Outside the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover knew as early as 1961. Hoover said nothing to the commission. Saddest of all, Robert Kennedy knew. Kennedy was aware of the mafia's involvement in CIA efforts to kill Castro since at least May of 1961. He was then told in a memorandum from J. Edgar Hoover. Kennedy was told again a year later by CIA briefers. Bobby Kennedy said nothing to the commission. None of these individuals brought the Castro assassination plots to the commission's attention. Equally significant, none of them brought the plots to the attention of President Lyndon Johnson at the time that Johnson appointed the members of the commission, which was a week after Kennedy's assassination. There is no convincing evidence that I have seen that Johnson himself knew about the CIA's efforts to assassinate Castro before Johnson made those appointments. Now, let me stop here for just a moment before addressing the why question to add what may be an obvious caveat. I suggested that there's no convincing evidence that Johnson knew. It's easy to establish knowledge if someone has been told something he knows. We look to evidence. It's next to impossible, however, to establish ignorance. It's next to impossible because we simply don't have and cannot get evidence that a person was never told something. This is particularly true when we're talking about things that are not reduced to writing, like assassination plots. We know that Allen Dulles was briefed and gave his approval because there's documentary evidence in the CIA's files that establishes that he did that. But obviously, there's no documentary evidence that Lyndon Johnson did not know about the CIA's plots when he appointed the commission's membership. Whispered conversations generally are not documented. In its 2014 report on the Kennedy assassination, the CIA therefore rightly pointed out that it is not known if Dulles told any commissioners in private about the CIA's plots to kill Castro, unquote. Of course, that is true. It is also true that we don't know whether Bobby Kennedy told his friend Earl Warren in private or what other private conversations might have occurred. All we do know is what these individuals told the Warren Commission on the record about the plots, and we know that they said nothing. I once asked my friend, the late John Hart Ely, why the commission didn't investigate the implications of the plots to kill Castro. John was a lawyer on the commission staff. He was a law clerk to Chief Justice Earl Warren. He went on to become a very prominent constitutional law scholar and dean of the Stanford Law School. I thought John's answer to my question, I must say, was a bit defensive. He said, "They didn't tell us." Well, of course, John Ely was right. So in the end, it would not exonerate the agency if some day it comes out that one or more commissioners was privately told about the Castro assassination plots. The plot's implications were not explored because the commission, qua commission, was not told. Nor is there any evidence that Lyndon Johnson was told when he appointed to the commission the mastermind of the cover-up, Allen Dulles. In fact, the CIA, with Dulles's connivance, probably crossed the line from nonfeasance to malfeasance. The CIA put it this way in a 2014 report, quote, "Under McCone's and Helms's direction, the CIA's support for the Warren Commission was passive, reactive, and selective. CIA produced information only in response to commission requests and did not volunteer material even if potentially relevant, for example, about agency plots to assassinate Castro," unquote. Helms told the House Assassinations Committee in 1978 that if he wasn't asked for it, he didn't give it. Dulles, by some accounts, dominated the proceedings of the Warren Commission. He was fired by Kennedy, of course, after the Bay of Pigs debacle. He was the only member of the commission, therefore, who did not have a full-time day job, so he had plenty of time to arrange things. Dulles forewarned agency officers about the questions that he and his fellow commissioners were likely to ask. There may have been no explicit understanding between McCone and Dulles that helped Dulles steer the commission away from controversial agency operations, as the CIA found in 2014. But McCone, the agency, said, this is a quote from the agency's own report, listen to this. McCone, the agency, said, quote, "may be regarded as a co-conspirator in the JFK assassination cover-up," unquote. The conspiracy to keep the conspiracy to kill Castro secret after November 22nd. McCone, the agency, concluded, could rest assured that Dulles would keep dutiful watch over agency equities and work to keep the commission from pursuing provocative lines of investigation, such as the lethal anti-Castro covert actions, unquote. So the question is, why? Why did none of these individuals tell the Warren Commission about the efforts to assassinate Castro? The most generous explanation is that they saw their inaction as averting potential war. If it turned out that Castro was behind Kennedy's assassination, as Helms put it, we could have had a very nasty situation. What would be the retaliation? A startled America could do some extreme things, unquote. Lyndon Johnson may not have known about the CIA's plots to assassinate Castro, yet he appeared to share the CIA's impulse to avoid the risks of war that a full-scale investigation could have entailed. Johnson said, quote, "We've got to take this out of the arena where they're testifying that Khrushchev or Castro did this and chuck us into a war that can kill 40 million Americans in an hour," unquote. Johnson used this fear to browbeat several men into accepting his appointment to the Warren Commission. CIA leaders soon concluded, if they hadn't already, that the route to the best truth, as the agency called it, was to push the story that Oswald acted alone. In fact, that narrative may have been established as early as 3 days after the assassination. On November 25th, 1963, the Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach sent a famous memo to President Johnson's press secretary, Bill Moyers. Katzenbach recommended that the president appoint a commission to investigate Kennedy's death. And Katzenbach laid out in that memo to Johnson what he thought should be the commission's clear purpose. Quote, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, unquote. The objective, in other words, should not really be to investigate. The objective should be to calm the public's fears and suspicions and to avoid broader inquiries that could lead to personal embarrassment, national disgrace, and possibly even armed conflict. In February of 1964, Earl Warren himself seemed to acknowledge as much. Warren told reporters, right in the middle of the Commission's investigation, that the truth about the assassination might not be known, quote, in your lifetime, unquote. Of course, people act for mixed motives, and it's not, well, it's easy to rationalize darker intentions. There are, in fact, less charitable reasons that may explain the actions of the CIA's and the FBI's leaders. Public disclosure of the plots could have ruined their careers and their reputations. Disclosure could conceivably have exposed them to criminal liability. It could have revealed omissions, negligence, and ham-handedness in their conduct of the investigation, particularly on the part of the FBI. It could, therefore, have generated calls for more rigorous congressional oversight of agencies that at the time were largely self-policing, and still are, I might add. It could even have triggered efforts to abolish the CIA or to get it out of covert operations and limit its role to intelligence gathering. Harry Truman proposed just that in a stunning Washington Post op-ed piece that was published only a month after Kennedy's assassination. None of this explains Robert Kennedy's silence. Why didn't Robert Kennedy inform the Warren Commission himself? Following the Bay of Pigs fiasco, after all, his brother had famously said that he wished he could break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Presumably, Bobby Kennedy shared that same impulse, at least for a while. But he himself was deeply involved in the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, and his animosity toward the agency may later have diminished. Helms testified that the agency was under considerable pressure from the Kennedy administration to get rid of Fidel Castro. Robert Kennedy could have believed that his brother's standing in history and his own reputation would have been tarnished if the Castro assassination plots ever became public. It's possible, in fact, that Robert Kennedy blamed himself for his brother's murder. When I worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I had a conversation with Senator George McGovern that has always stuck in my mind. McGovern was a friend of Robert and Jacqueline Kennedy. In 1978, McGovern's subcommittee on international operations was engaged in an inquiry into the activities of foreign intelligence agencies within the United States, including DINA, SAVAK, and the other intelligence services of some of America's upstanding allies. My colleagues and I had recently questioned CIA officers in Langley about the agency's liaison relationship with these foreign services. One day after work, I stopped by McGovern's office to brief him on what we had learned. This was in 1978. No one else was present. McGovern mixed the two of us Tanqueray martinis. The topic turned to assassinations, and then the assassination of President Kennedy. I mentioned that Castro had warned only 2 months beforehand that American leaders would not be safe if they were aiding in terrorist plots to kill Cuban leaders. I was standing at the time staring out the window, and McGovern said that after the assassination, Bobby Kennedy would come to his office and just stare out the window like that for the longest time, saying nothing. I said Kennedy might have been inordinately depressed because he felt responsible for his brother's assassination, because Castro found out about the plots to kill him and retaliated by ordering the assassination of President Kennedy. McGovern said, yes, that is what Bobby believed. I had the temerity to ask McGovern how he knew that. McGovern replied, Jackie told me. Let me be very clear about this. I myself have no way of knowing whether Castro was in any way involved, or what Robert Kennedy or Jacqueline Kennedy ultimately came to believe, or whether their beliefs, whatever they were in the end, were based upon hard evidence or sheer speculation. George McGovern did not say that he believed that Castro was involved. McGovern never told me what he believed, and I did not ask. I knew Ted Sorensen. I told Sorensen about this conversation with McGovern, and I asked him who he believed was behind Kennedy's assassination. Sorensen said he didn't know and hadn't tried to find out because nothing could bring John Kennedy back, because it was too painful for him to revisit the matter. When I was in Cuba in the 1980s during a long multi-cigar afternoon with Ricardo Alarcón, I asked him about this. Alarcón had been Castro's ambassador to the UN and was very close to Fidel Castro. As I expected he would, Alarcón denied it. He said that they, the Cubans, would have been crazy to do such a thing because the retaliation would have been devastating if the Americans found out. Friends of mine who were on the church committee staff tell me it's highly likely that the mafia was behind Kennedy's assassination. I worked closely with Frank Church on the Foreign Relations Committee, but I never asked Church what he believed had happened, and I never heard Church express his own opinion. So in sum, I don't know. I have no fixed opinion as to who was involved in President Kennedy's assassination or why he was killed. The circumstantial evidence that I am aware of is incomplete and contradictory. More than one person had a motive to kill Kennedy, the capacity to do so, and the opportunity to do so. The CIA cover-up discredited the Warren Commission's investigation, but that obviously does not mean that anyone in the CIA was involved, nor does it mean that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. I therefore conclude by returning to the question that I began with. What does the cover-up of the Castro assassination plots have to do with double government? The answer, unfortunately, is a lot, and it still does, because the monumental lesson that that cover-up teaches us still has not been learned. Double government subsists on insider arrogance. The ultimate insiders, the managers of this nation's national security bureaucracy, have acquired the broad power that they now exercise in the belief that they know better than the American people what is best for this nation's security. They have managed to convince Congress and the courts and even the president's staff that they should be deferred to because their expertise will lead to wiser decisions than those based on the judgment of the American people and their elected representatives. Dean Acheson's attitude perfectly embodied that belief. Acheson said, quote, "If you truly had a democracy and did what the people wanted, you'd go wrong every time," unquote. That was the belief of the CIA leaders who covered up their plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. The people can't handle the truth, so we have to give them the best truth, a truth that omitted the agency's efforts to kill Castro. It was that distrust of government, that distrust in democracy, that distrust in the people that more than anything else led to the cover-up. The possibility did not seem to occur to the agency that perhaps the people can be trusted to know what's in their best interest, that perhaps government distrust of the people causes the people to distrust the government, and that perhaps democracy would be strengthened, not weakened, if government trusted the people. Justice Brandeis wrote, "Government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example." It seems to me that if the government of this country ever wants to be trusted again, it can start by setting an example. Thank you.